So Avot, really? So Avot is a small section of the Mishnah, which was compiled in about the year 200 of the Common Era, just 1800 years ago, by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, based on initial work done by Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, and others in the previous generations. Avot is the only portion of the Mishnah that has no halacha, no rules or regulations. Instead, it contains ethical teachings. It contains advice to judges and would-be judges, advice to Torah scholars and would-be Torah scholars, and aphorisms addressed to the general population. So I'm not wearing a mask, whereas you are, and I just wanted to recount that yesterday I was laning with a mask, and I sort of struggled through laning just 10 verses because I just couldn't get enough breath to speak with a mask on. So I can't teach otherwise. So the teachers cited in Avot spanned 500 years, from about 300 before the Common Era to about 200 of the Common Era. A lot was happening during those 500 years of Avot. There was life under Persian rule, then life under Greek rule, then life under Roman rule. There were conflicts between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, between Hillel and Shammai, and there was the rise of Christianity. There were the rebellions of the Maccabees, which of course was successful, and the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, which of course was not successful. The Holy Temple and the Holy City of Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era, and the Holocaust that took place 60 years later, also by the Romans, was second only to the Holocaust of our times. None of these historical happenings are mentioned in Avot, nor perhaps in the entire Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers and their descendants were optimistically focused on building a new Judaism and didn't want to be distracted by current events. Rabbi Yochanan himself had been smuggled out of Jerusalem before it was destroyed and received permission from the general Vespasian to found an academy at Yavne. And the efforts of Rabbi Yochanan and his students and their successors and their followers, starting in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed, culminated in the codification of the Mishnah 130 years later by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, 3 major developments took place in Judaism during this period, and they will be the focus of today's session. These 3 developments were, first, the concept of the oral Torah, Torah She'Ba'al Peh. Second, the adoption of the belief in Olam Haba, the world to come. And third, the rise of rabbinic scholarship. So I'm going to go through each of those in order. So let's first discuss the oral Torah. So the first chapter of Pirkei Avot explicitly claims that all practices of Judaism that were not in the written Torah, the scroll from which we read to this day, were communicated orally to Moses by God at Sinai and transmitted from the sages of one generation to the next without change over the 1,000 years from Moses to Hillel. So let us see how that notion is presented. Now, are there handouts for people who don't have them already?
Yes.
Yes. So let's.
Do I need a handout?
Yes, and several people do.
Pass them around. But I don't want to take one. Do we have to-
Is this a handout?
No.
Okay, then we need them. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So the very first Mishnah of Avot, number 1 on today's handout, begins with a disarmingly simple statement that lays the groundwork for the teachings that are to come. Moses received Torah from God at Sinai, transmitted it to Joshua, who transmitted it to the elders, who transmitted it to the prophets, who transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. And then it continues, they said, we'll come back to that later. And the structure of this chapter continues the pattern established in the first Mishnah. So the next Mishnah says, Shimon the righteous was one of the last members of the great assembly. And then Antigonos of Socho received Torah from Shimon the righteous. And then Yossi received Torah from Antigonos. And then Yeshua and Nitai received Torah from Yossi. And then Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shatach received Torah from them. And then Shmaya and Talion received Torah from them. And then Hillel and Shammai received Torah from them. So very clear sequence of passage of the Torah from one generation to the next. By the way, so that you know a little bit about the timeline here, Hillel died in the year 10 of the Common Era, having lived for 120 years. That's the tradition, and there's good reason to believe that he lived very long. So maybe not 120, but the tradition is that he lived for 120. Thus, the author of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, tells us that the teachings of the Mishnah that he has compiled have been handed down from one generation to the next by an unbroken chain of sages dating back over 1,000 years. What we are writing here in the Mishnah, he is telling the Jewish people, carries with it the weight of 1,000 years of authority. What exactly was transmitted from generation to generation, from one sage to the next? So the obvious answer is that it was the scroll on which is written the 5 books of Moses, the Torah that every synagogue preserves in its ark and reads from regularly. But the obvious answer is incorrect. If they were talking about a scroll, then its guardians would not have to be reliable sages who were concerned about transmitting the Torah correctly from generation to generation. After all, anyone could hand off a scroll to anyone else. What they're talking about here is what's called, they don't refer to it here this way, but it's called the oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh. That is, the underlying assumption of this Mishnah is that in addition to the written Torah that is recorded in the scroll, there's an oral Torah that has never been collected together or written down until the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who is the great-grandson of Hillel's great-grandson, just so that you know what the generations, it's half a dozen generations from Hillel to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who lived in the year 200. After all, Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights with God on the mountain. What was happening all those hours? Obviously, God was providing Moses with instructions about how to implement the concise statements in the written Torah. And those instructions had to be carefully preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next, as described in the opening words of Avot, from one elder to the next. Thus, not only did the rabbis of the Mishnah speak with the authority of 50 generations of sages, they were also the recipients of a carefully guarded and transmitted oral version of the Torah that was originally disclosed by God to Moses. In addition to these two sources of authority, an unbroken chain and an unwritten tradition, the initial Mishnah of Pirkei Avot provides the rabbis of the Mishnah with a third source of authority. One of the 3 statements, the last one under Mishnah 1.1, is make a fence around the Torah, asu siyag la Torah. That is, in order to prevent people from violating the Torah, the sages should, not just may, add additional prohibitions that will act as safeguards to keep people away from violations. So, for example, to ensure that you will not spend money on Shabbat, it was ordained that you should not touch money on Shabbat. Simple fence. So this statement to make a fence around the Torah from about 5 centuries before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi gave the rabbis the authority to make a variety of prohibitions that, like fences, prevent people from violating actual prohibitions of the Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah. Postulating the existence of the oral Torah was a necessity, because in the Torah, God explicitly states, do not add or subtract from the instructions that I'm giving you. Do not add or subtract from the instructions that I'm giving you, Deuteronomy. So, for example, the Bible prohibits boiling a kid in its mother's milk. It says that 3 times. Don't eat meat and milk together. A substantial addition to the biblical prohibition. So the laws of kashrut certainly sound like a substantial addition. So they must have been part of God's original instructions. They're not in the written Torah, so they must have been communicated orally by God to Moses. Apparently, the prohibition of eating chicken with milk was not part of the oral Torah. Interestingly enough, Maimonides claims that that was a further offense that was added later on by the rabbis after the oral Torah had been completed. Why did they do that? Well, it was a necessary offense because obviously people were eating chicken with milk and they said, this tastes pretty good. Maybe I should try beef with milk too. So they prohibited that as a later addition. No one disputes that there was, in fact, an oral Torah. Every system of laws grows as new situations arise, new questions are asked, and as social circumstances change. That is, every system of laws changes organically. However, the existence of an oral Torah that was given by God to Moses at Sinai and handed down unchanged for 30 generations is flawed in a number of ways, which I will outline briefly. First of all, the idea of an oral Torah was not accepted by all Jews. It was not accepted by the Sadducees, who were the religious and political leadership of the Jewish community until the destruction of the temple. Once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees essentially disappeared from the scene. So the victors, namely the Pharisees, were able to rewrite history from their own perspective, as we know happens occasionally. And so from their perspective, the oral Torah was something which existed forever, whereas the Sadducees denied that. The idea that a huge body of information, like that contained in the Mishnah, so Avot is maybe 2% of the Mishnah, so the Mishnah is quite large. The idea that a huge body of information could be transmitted reliably for 1,000 years does not make sense, as we know from the telephone game. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. One person says something to a second, second to a third, third to a fourth. By the time you get to the 5th person, the message is completely distorted. And also, there is no evidence in the Bible that any prophet transmitted information to another prophet. The prophets were essentially independent. So the idea that is expressed in Mishnah, the first Mishnah here, is that the prophets transmitted it from generation to generation. There's no evidence for that. Elisha was a student of Elijah, but other than that, they were all separate one from the other. There's no evidence in the Bible that additional laws were observed. For example, when we listen to the Haftorah on Yom Kippur, we read a chapter of Isaiah, and Isaiah talks about Yom Kippur, and he talks about Shabbat, and it's no different than what's in the Torah. He doesn't add anything. Or when we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, or whenever we read it, the marriage that she has with Boaz has to go through a process because she should be marrying the closest kinsman, and the ceremony described there is no different than what's described in the Torah. So there's no evidence in the Bible that there was an oral Torah which was followed. If the oral Torah was just transmitted from one person to another person in each generation, then it was not observed by all the people if it was this sort of secret transmission, which seems to be implied in number 1 here. It also assumes that the Jews, who God calls a very contentious people, had no disagreements about the law for 1,000 years until the time of Hillel and Shammai, when there were disagreements. And it's interesting that once Hillel and Shammai had their disagreements, the rabbi said, well, what is the oral law? They said, well, no, there's now we have two Torahs. So clearly, when Hillel and Shammai had their disagreements, that sort of ended the period of the oral law, and everything after that was more conjecture than part of the oral law. And as I said before, a system of laws has to grow organically, with changes made as the need arises, which is not what is described here in Mishnah 1.1. Maimonides, interestingly enough, does not, in his commentary on Avot, does not object to Mishnah 1.1. He is a very cautious man. He doesn't object to anything that he reads of the ancient sages or of Aristotle, who he also tried to integrate into Judaism successfully. But what he does is somewhere else, he writes something about this, and somewhere else he actually writes basically what I just said, that the oral law was something which grew organically over time. So this Mishnah is very striking in that it sort of contradicts. There are many ways of saying, hey, that's not the case. Another thing is that in the list that I wrote down on this sheet here, Mishnah 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, there's a big gap because they didn't have anybody after Antigonos. The next two people, Yosef ben Yoezer and Yosef ben Yochanan, were at least 100 years after Antigonos. So they could not have received it from Antigonos. So there's a gap in their, in Mishnaic times, there's already a gap in their understanding of the sequence. Yosef and Yosef were both the leaders of the Sanhedrin during the time of the Maccabees. And one of them was executed by the Greeks. Antigonos was at the first half of the 3rd century before the Common Era. That was 100 years, 150 years earlier. So there are gaps.
Joe,
Yes.
I'm wondering whether the gaps are literally gaps, or that whoever was was between Shimon the Righteous and Antigonos was perhaps somebody who was just a passive transman, whereas from 1, 2 to 1, 3, from 3 to 4, 4 to 6, we have each of those person added something.
Yes. So that is a possibility. In fact, one striking gap that comes up right after this is Hillel's son. Hillel has a son called Shimon, who's the head of the Sanhedrin. He's not quoted in Avot. And in an article written in the Jewish Encyclopedia, which was written in 1902 to 1906, the person writing the article, it was either Solomon Schechter or Louis Ginsburg, said that all we know about Hillel's son Shimon is his name. And so that's exactly what you're suggesting, that he may have transmitted it, but never have done anything that furthered it. Okay, so let me just conclude this portion. The oral Torah, as described in the first chapter of Avot, is accepted as fact by Orthodox Jews. So Orthodoxy accepts Mishnah 1.1 here as written. Okay, for the rest of the Jewish community, the issue is moot. We all recognize that the Judaism we follow, or we don't follow, is based on what is considered the oral Torah. But whether or not it is exactly what God told Moses at Sinai is not considered important or significant. And so there's a big division in the Jewish community on this issue. Let me pause here to see if there are any other questions or comments. Yes. Please.
I seem to remember, like I started reading the book a while back. You
Yes,
seem to make a distinction, if I remember correctly, between the statement so-and-so transmitted it, so-and-so received it, so-and-so. Do you-
I don't recognize that, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah,
But
it had something to do with the clarity with which it was that everybody's a filter, and therefore, if quote, it was transmitted, that means the sender sent it, but the receiver may not have received it.
I see.
Whereas if it was received, it was,
It was,
it was taken in whole.
I see. Okay, if I make that distinction, okay.
I thought you did.
Okay, could be. Could be. I certainly have not memorized the book, but thank you. Yes, Michelle.
Wonder how the rabbis, did they further develop the idea of oral law? Did they just sort of accept this as just something, or did they defend it if there were certain things that they saw that it was different?
So, yeah. So in the end, everything becomes oral law. So in other words, what we have today and what we say today is part of the tradition of transmission of the oral law. And so there are different viewpoints. Hillel and Shammai had different viewpoints, and in the end, a voice comes from heaven and says, these are the words of the living God, so that both Hillel's views and Shammai's views were consistent with the oral law, and presumably everything that comes afterwards is also part of the oral law. But I think that for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the oral law was something very specific. What he was writing down was the oral law. But later generations obviously took what they were saying as part of the oral law as well. So I guess that responds to your question. Yeah. Did someone else had a question? Okay. Now, so this completes our discussion of the first of the three major developments of Judaism in the 500 years preceding and during the time of the Mishnah. That's the oral Torah. So the second major development is the adoption of the belief in Olam Haba, the world to come. So the idea, I'm going to give you I'm going to have you study these texts together in a moment, but the idea that the dead will return to life does not appear in the Torah, or indeed in the whole Bible. In the Bible, people who die go down to Sheol, which seems to be a euphemism for under the ground, or to Duma, which means silence. They are not heard from again. Only in the book of Daniel, which was written likely in the 2nd century before the Common Era, after the end of the biblical period, do we find an explicit reference to life after death. In the centuries before and just after the beginning of the Common Era, the idea of a life after death gained prominence, mainly to answer the question of why do good people suffer, whereas evildoers flourish? If there's a life after death, then the answer to the question is that all imbalances will be rectified in the next life. The good people will get their rewards, and the evil their punishments, their just deserts, as expressed in Daniel. So Daniel, here's a quote from Daniel, or the quote from Daniel. At that time, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. In the Bible itself, reward and punishment come in this life, as presented explicitly in Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat. How does it end? It says, though the wicked flourish like grass, they will be destroyed forever. However, the righteous shall flourish like date palms and grow mighty like cedars in Lebanon. And I should now sing to you, Tzadik katamar yifrach, ke'erez bavanon yiskeh. However, you won't want me to sing it. I think you recognize the words. It is only in this life that we can express our gratitude to God. For as it says in Hallel, which we recite on all holidays, and on Rosh Chodesh, Lo hametim yahalluya, lo kol yordei duma. The dead cannot praise you, nor can those who go down to silence. But we can and will praise you now and forever. Hallelujah. Very clear statement. These verses are echoed in Isaiah 38. We cannot praise you in Sheol, praise you from death, or testify to your truth from the pit. Only the one who is alive, yes, alive, can praise you as I do today. That's the quote from Isaiah. Since we may assume that one of our prominent roles in any life after death would be to praise God, no praise of God implies no life after death, from Isaiah's perspective. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to ask you to, in groups, that you can have this one group on this side, one group on that side, and the third group with Neil on Zoom, to look at, please read aloud and discuss number 2 through number 6 on your handouts. Okay, 2 through 6. So if you want to form a circle on this side and circle on this side, or if you want to break into 2 groups, there's enough people to do that as well. So read and discuss numbers 2. Okay, very good. So we can continue. Hopefully we'll have time for one more breakout session to look at the third of the 3 developments. But let's talk about this one first. So who gets into Olam Haba?
Well, there's a conflict. On one hand, it says the person who has acquired knowledge of Torah, and then the last one says all Jews have a share.
Yeah, isn't that striking? Hillel says, is very specific. Hillel has access to Olam Haba only for those who are Torah scholars. Whoops.
They keep talking.
Whereas,
They just can't see you.
whereas at the end of the day, 200 years after Hillel, their view of Olam Haba has changed dramatically so that everyone gets into Olam Haba. Okay? Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek Olam Haba. Now, that's not completely true. They immediately list various exceptions, but we can assume for the moment that maybe none of us are in those lists of exceptions. But clearly a major change has come about. When I read Pirkei Avot in the past, I didn't recognize that because Hillel is very in the beginning, and the statement about every Jew being a place in Olam Haba is not actually part of Avot. It's from Mishnah of Sanhedrin, but it's a paragraph which is read at the beginning of each chapter of Pirkei Avot. So when anyone starts any chapter of Pirkei Avot, they read that verse first. And why is that? Well, because initially when people started reading Pirkei Avot in the 8th or 9th century on a regular basis, as is done to this day, during the time between Pesach and Shavuot, and sometimes even later, I suspect that many people got afraid. They said, oh, Hillel says I can't get into Olam Haba. So they took this Mishnah that is from Sanhedrin and put it at the top of each chapter of Avot, so that people would say, oh, even though Hillel said that I don't get in, the answer of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi 200 years later was that, yes, I do get in. So the very striking difference between the early Mishnah and the late Mishnah. Yes.
I think we discussed that as a problem contradiction to the prior stuff. But if you look at share as an opportunity, in other words, every view has the opportunity to get into Olam Haba, but it's dependent on your deeds and your.
Okay, that could be an interpretation. The word in Hebrew is chelek. Chelek means a portion rather than a share, in the sense that it's part of your inheritance. that you automatically get the proportion, unless you're one of the exceptions. So that your interpretation is certainly a good interpretation, but that reflects my not translating it well enough. Okay, anyone else have anything to say about that issue? Okay, any other comments about these readings? Do all of them agree with Rabbi Hillel except for that one? No. Again, I found this very striking. So in my book, what I try to do is compare different Mishnayot which deal with the same topic, which is not what's usually done. So I find all sorts of interesting things. So here Hillel says that if you acquire a good name, that's just for yourself, not so important. What's really important is studying Torah. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, on the other hand, he says, a good name is the most important thing. It's more important than you're being a priest or not a priest. It's more important that you're being royalty or not. It's more important than studying Torah or not studying Torah. That the important thing is that you have a good name. How do you get a good name? Well, you act ethically, you do good deeds, and so on. I was when I went to Poland 10 years ago. We wandered through various cemeteries, of course, because there were no Jews living in Poland. So we wandered through cemeteries, and I came across a tombstone where it said that this person was Mukhtar b'ma'asim tovim. And Mukhtar is sort of the passive version of the word Keter, crown. So they took the word Keter, which means crown. He was crowned by his good deeds. So that was the expression on his tombstone. So this person must have been one who, did many good deeds, to the point that they saw that his good deeds as serving as a crown for him. That's such a beautiful image. And Rabbi Chanina, so when I first saw this Mishnah 4:17, I said, how could Shimon Bar Yochai disagree with Hillel? Shimon Bar Yochai was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He lived in the middle of the 2nd century, 150 years after Hillel. How could he disagree with the great Hillel? Well, he obviously did. Okay, and similarly, the next one, Rabbi Chanina said, if you have wisdom without deeds, if you don't translate your knowledge into action, into good deeds, so what good is your Torah? So just simply being a scholar of Torah is not sufficient. If you don't translate it into good deeds, then your knowledge is for nothing. Very striking. Again, in opposition to what Hillel has said. Anyone have any other comments or questions?
I don't understand what I understand about Musa.
Yeah, okay.
Could you repeat that comment? The mic.
Yeah, the mic didn't pick that up. So you say you're saying that what Rabbi Chanina says sounds like what Musar would say, and yes, that's certainly correct. That in fact, the Musar movement focuses on ethical behavior, and he says is if you have learning without ethical behavior, that doesn't really count. Your learning is for naught, so to speak. That you have to somehow incorporate ethical behavior into your learning. Yes.
I think a corollary could be that if you study Torah and you don't do anything with it, you really haven't acquired wisdom.
Right.
You've acquired some knowledge.
Right.
But you have to act on it in order to really have acquired Torah.
Yes. Right. Okay. We've discussed all of them from 2 to 6. No, we haven't discussed number 5. Number 5 that is not really. I put it there just to indicate that at least Rabbi Tarfon, who was also a student of Rabbi Akiva and a colleague of Rabbi Akiva, understood that the purpose of Olam Haba was to correct the situation in this world. Okay, in the sense that if you're a righteous person in this world and you didn't get rewarded in this world, you'll get rewarded in the next world. Okay, so he very clearly sees Olam Haba as a way of solving the problem of why do the righteous suffer in this world. Okay, let's see. So now let me go back to where I am. Of course, I don't know where I am here. 1 second. Okay, so we did talk about that. Okay, so why didn't this problem and this solution arise earlier? Okay, I mean, the Bible, as I said, has no hint of Olam Haba, of a world to come. Everything happens in this world. So perhaps in earlier times, people didn't see themselves as individuals. They saw themselves as members of a clan or a tribe. So their focus was on the fate of the group, not so much on their individual fates. As the herding life in Genesis gives way to the agricultural life, and that gives way to the commercial life, people saw themselves more as individuals rather than as members of the tribe. By the time of the Mishnah, the original tribes had disappeared. I mean, the only ones that were left after the 10 tribes were carried off were, well, many of the 10 tribes probably just came south and joined the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, but the distinction between the tribes was basically lost. So as a result, the response that all will be well with your tribe waned in significance, and they began to think of themselves as individuals, and they thought about their lives and their futures. Perhaps the solution that I read before from Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, no longer satisfied people. But even among the psalmists, there was a sense that all was not right with the world. So, for example, Psalm 94 calls upon God to fulfill the divine commitment and complains bitterly about God's delay in delivering the appropriate punishments. It goes like this. It says, "You are a God of vengeance. Act as a God of vengeance should do. Rise up, judge of the earth. Give the arrogant what they deserve. How long will the wicked, Adonai, how long will the wicked be jubilant?" That sounds like a pretty strong protest. Ad matai rishayim Adonai. Ad matai rishayim ya'alozu. Another reason why life after death was an appealing solution in the first few centuries of the Common Era was the intense suffering by the people under Roman rule, including the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the Holocaust that took place during and after the Bar Kokhba revolt. When life was horrible, knowing that the righteous would be rewarded in another life must have provided consolation to those who were suffering. A similar response took place to the great suffering and numerous casualties of the Civil War in the United States. It was only then that the idea took hold that people will be reunited with their families after death. Before that, that was not in Christianity an expected form of world to come. So the question of what Judaism believes happened to us after we die is a complicated one, and we have touched here only on the notion of Olam Haba. We haven't talked about resurrection. We haven't talked about Din v'cheshbon, which means judgment and accounting, which is referred to in Yom Kippur. We haven't talked about hell. We haven't talked about Mashiach. We haven't talked about Gan Eden, only on the rewards of the righteous. But the solution of Olam Haba is a generous one. All Jews have a portion in the world to come, with some important exceptions. And that's also true for all ethical monotheists who are not Jewish. That seems to be the case, that over the years, the rabbis have debated this question and have come to the conclusion that someone who's not Jewish and who is ethical and a monotheist deserves a place in Olam Haba as well. So we're somewhat more generous than the evangelical Protestants who assign all of us to hell automatically. So that's the question of what Judaism believes is a complicated one. The question of what individual Jews believe is also complicated. Many people who do not believe in Olam Haba will still console their dying parent by telling them that they will be reunited with their deceased spouse. Even though the reunion of families is not part of the Jewish belief either. We also didn't discuss when Olam Haba begins. Does it begin as soon as you die, or does everybody have to wait till the end of days, which is when Olam Haba begins? For those who believe in reunions of families, of course, Olam Haba must have started already, a long time ago. So Rabbi Akiva may have already consumed the entire feast that was set up for Olam Haba. Okay, let's see. Let's see if there are any comments or questions before we go on. No, okay. Let's see where we are on time now. 33, good. Okay, so we now move on to the third development that took place in Judaism in this era, the rise of rabbinic scholarship. In this period, the study of Torah had become of great value and of great importance, partly because once the temple was destroyed, the rabbis replaced the Kohanim, the priests, as teachers. So one of the role of the Kohanim in the temple was to teach. Temple gone, so the rabbis became the teachers. So we had a new class of teachers replacing an old class. It's partly because the Romans prohibited even the teaching of Torah. So even though the emperor Vespasian in the year 70 granted Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai the right to establish an academy at Yavne, by the year 130, they captured Akiva and they tortured and killed him for teaching Torah publicly. So the Romans at some point changed their perspective and became very much against the teaching of Torah. So that made it even more important because we didn't want to lose the Torah. The oral Torah became harder to preserve in the face of Roman oppression. And also, it was very important for rabbinic scholarship to come about because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers tried to establish, and successfully, a new version of Judaism, one which has lasted to this day. So with that introduction, brief though it is, I'm going to ask you to read and discuss the remaining texts, numbers 7 through 11. Ask yourself to whom these texts are addressed. To whom these texts are addressed. Okay, so we'll take another 15 minutes for that, and then we'll have a final discussion.
We do that as a larger group because the virtual breakout room is a disaster.
Okay, so you suggest we do that as a larger group. Okay, so let's do that as a larger group then. Okay. All right, so we have 7 through 11. So I will read and I'll ask you for comments. Okay, so Shammai said, this is number 7, which is Mishnah 115. Shammai said, make your study of Torah keva, at a fixed time. What does that mean?
You need to set time for it every day, which is more than it says. It doesn't say daily, but it has to be the foundation. Everything else is negotiable. Yeah, you have to go to work. You could be a little late for work. You can't be a little late for Torah.
Okay. Other comments? Yeah.
I take it as a routine.
Routine. Okay, yes. So in other words, you should have routinely have a time for study. He doesn't say how often. He doesn't say when it should be. He just says that make it a routine. Make it a routine. Yes. Yeah.
The way I see it is, you have to set time aside for it. Otherwise, you will never get around to it.
Right. You have to set time for it, otherwise you will never get around to it. That's exactly right. I mean, the same thing applies to exercising, the same thing applies to many other things in our lives. If we pick a time for it and sort of put it in our calendar, then it happens. My daughter sent me a note, sent me a Facebook picture last night saying, here's a picture of the date that I had with my daughter, with her daughter. So they have a date night every so often where she meets only with that daughter and so on. And it's in her calendar. And so that's what Rabbi Tarfon is saying. Another several Shammai saying, have a fixed time for studying Torah. Now, to who does this apply? This sounds like it applies to everyone, right? Sounds like it applies to everyone. So everyone should have a fixed time for study. So I, for example, people often refer to me as a rabbi, which I am not, but I have pretty much for my whole adult life had study partners with whom I have studied with on a regular basis, on a fixed time each week. It's going to add something to that. Yes. So just like exercising, here that's exercising by yourself often is challenging, and so one way of making sure that you play tennis every week is you have a partner who you play tennis with, or you have a running partner, or you have a swimming partner, and so on. So the idea of having a partner, chavrusa is the term in Aramaic, is a part of that makes it possible for you to do something regularly. So in fact, even to this day, I have 3 people who I study with regularly every week, and I've done that pretty much my whole adult life. So that when people ask me, well, how do you know so much about Judaism? I say, well, I learned from all of the people that I've studied with. So that's a very clear statement by Shammai that's addressed to everybody. Now look at the next one, number 8. Rabbi Hanania ben Sradion said, if 2 sit together and no words of Torah are spoken between them, then this is considered a session of scoffers. Now, the word scoffer is the Hebrew word is unclear. It's translated in various ways. So scoffer, you can replace that by some other negative noun. But if 2 sit together and speak words of Torah between them, then the Shekhinah abides among them. Comments, what do you think that means? Yes.
Great poetry.
It's great poetry. It sounds very nice.
I mean, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of like Lashon Hara, there's gossip, there's kind of idle talk
Right.
and what is it contributing to your life? Whereas if you talk about Torah, the Shekhinah is to me, that is a very beautiful image, that there's a holiness about your relationship and your.
Okay. Your conversation, yes. Excuse me?
Where does Shekhinah come from? That's not a concept in Torah.
I don't, so that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that off the top of my head. I'm not sure, but certainly they were aware of it in Mishnaic times. Is it in Torah? I don't know that it is, but I may be wrong. Okay, so yeah, but they clearly had a sense of, and it's not clear what they meant by Shekhinah. I mean, in other words, nowadays Shekhinah is seen as the feminine aspect of God, or as God's presence. It's not clear how they understood it. So one danger in trying to read or trying to translate ancient texts is that you have to be aware that the words change meaning. That just because something means a certain thing today doesn't mean it meant the same thing before. So, for example, I'll give you another example. The word shtika, as everyone who's been to summer camp knows, means quiet, everybody. but the word shtika is used several times in Avot, and doesn't mean quiet. It means be an active listener. Means be a listener, but active listener. Doesn't mean just sit quietly. So it's clearly a different meaning of that word. So this is actually a very challenging Mishnah, because we all have multiple conversations in the course of a day. And the idea that each conversation should have some spiritual content to it, some spiritual exchange between the two people involved in the conversation, is very challenging. Because many of the conversations that we have, even if they're not, bad gossip, but they're just ordinary conversations, it's sort of hard to interject into an ordinary conversation spiritual content. So words of Torah we have to accept as being loose. It doesn't have to be words of the Torah, but just expressing gratitude, for example, is and saying how important it is to express gratitude. That is a spiritual contribution to not only that you're putting into the conversation, but for the recipient. So it is possible for us to do that, but it's challenging to do because we're not used to that.
Well, it's interesting that you call words of Torah spiritual,
Yes.
as another person talked about this as being poetic.
Yes.
Because if you look at how words of Torah can be misused to
Yes.
rebuke someone, for example,
Yes.
this passage does not apply to those people.
No. No, certainly there's some words of Torah which are not helpful. Yes, okay. Okay, now let's see, I just want to check the time here. Okay. So anyone else want to comment on this one? Okay. So the next one is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was one of the two principal students of Rabbi Akiva. He and Shimon Bar Yochai were the two principal students of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Meir apparently made drafts of the Mishnah. He's often mentioned very frequently in the Mishnah. And so when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put together the entire Mishnah in the year 200 or 220 or whenever it was, he had substantial pieces of it already composed by others. So, for example, Rabbi Akiva is credited with having arranged the Mishnah in the sense that that the Mishnah has six parts to it, because we sing that at the Seder. What is six? Six are the parts of the Mishnah. So those 6 parts were apparently organized by Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva organized evidently the sections in each of those parts. And Rabbi Meir started filling in those sections. So by the time Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes around, the document is already structured, and much of it is there. Of course, nothing was written in word. You're supposed to laugh at that, but you didn't. Nothing was written down. This was all oral and memorized. Okay, so when I say that it had been prepared before, everything that was done orally. Okay, let's go on. So Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, by the way, Rabbi Meir is sometimes referred to as Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes, miracle worker. And many people go to where his tomb is in Israel and pray for miracles on their behalf. They don't pray to Rabbi Meir, they pray to the God of Rabbi Meir. Okay, and there's a story, if you read my book, it tells you why he's called Rabbi Meir, the miracle worker. But he says here, engage but little in business and busy yourself with the Torah. And the pun there is intentional because he says business is referred to as osek in Hebrew, and he said it's better that you're osek b'Torah. And probably the blessing that we have, which is said before studying of Torah, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, that's probably due to his pun here. So he says here, engage but little in business and busy yourself with the Torah. In other words, you should be studying Torah all the time. So whereas the first two of the Mishnayot that we read, the one of Shammai and the one of Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion, are addressed to everybody, this is addressed to people who want to be serious Torah scholars. And he says you should really spend all of your time studying Torah. You may need to earn a living. Okay, you earn a living. But you should not try to spend all your time in your business. You should be a Toraholic instead of a workaholic. Okay, let's see. Any comment about that?
So it reminds me, there's another place in the Talmud where some rabbi suggests that you have this fixed time for studying Torah, and that's good. But what you get a reward for is what you study outside the fixed time.
I see. Okay. All right. That's a little bit discouraging because then because you can be rewarded for your efforts and not be, that shouldn't be discarded. Okay. So Maimonides very strongly agrees with the perspective of Rabbi Meir in theory, but he had a full-time job. He was the chief physician to Saladin, who at the time was the Caliph of Egypt, Palestine, and Arabia. So he had a full-time job, and he would complain. He would complain that he would come back at night, and waiting for him would be, he was a physician, so waiting for him was all the Jewish community with all of their medical needs, and he wouldn't get to his Torah until late at night. And so he complained about this, but nevertheless, he kept that full-time job. I guess it was the kind of job which he couldn't leave. He couldn't tell Saladin he was going to retire. It's actually very strange. Saladin there were a lot of objections to hiring a Jewish doctor by the Muslim community, but Saladin probably went with Maimonides because Maimonides was known as the best doctor around, but also probably that put a lot of pressure on Maimonides, because if Saladin were to get sick and die, then Maimonides could, of course, have been punished for not doing his job well. But it turns out that even though Maimonides and Saladin were born in the same year approximately, Maimonides outlived him by 10 years and had no negative consequences that we know of. So anyways, so the idea, there is an idea that one should spend all one's time on Torah. And as we see in the next Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon said, by the way, you'll notice that this Mishnah here, number 10, is the same number Mishnah as number 5. I gave different parts of the Mishnah. If you have studied much Torah, you shall be given much reward. Your employer can be trusted to pay you the reward of your labor. So that's a very strange phrasing, God as your employer. So it's interesting that in the Torah it says that an employer has to pay his employee every day because he needs the money. So using God here as an employer and saying you're going to be paid in the distant future doesn't quite square with Torah ethics. And it's interesting that there's another book called Avot Rabbi Natan, Avot of Rabbi Nathan, who we don't know who he was or whether he existed, which has it's sort of a commentary on Avot, but it's also an alternate version of Avot. They don't use that term. They speak of God as the person with whom you have a covenant, your covenantal partner. So instead of using the word Baal Malachtacha, your employer, it says Baal Britcha, the one with whom you have a covenant. And what's very striking to me is that the covenant, which plays such a strong role in Deuteronomy, the covenant between God and the people of Israel, has no mention at all in Avot. Very striking. Okay, let's see. Okay, Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, said. Now here, this is very curious. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is apparently the one who compiled the Mishnah. What is his son doing here? Yes.
Just from your last comment.
Yes.
I wanted to share something. I remember learning from Shai Held, Rabbi, that Maimonides never mentioned the covenant either. That's right.
I see. That's
He said that
interesting.
There was one, later corrected himself, said that there was one comment, it's a minor comment, where it's referred to the covenant, but it's not a topic of this writing at all.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I've read a lot of Maimonides, but not enough to be able to make a conclusion like that. But that's very interesting. And I wondered why. I conjecture that maybe it's because of God's apparent absence during the Roman period, when the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, the people were so many of them were killed, enslaved, raped, whatever. I mean, maybe there was a feeling that the covenant was sort of not apparent. I don't know. But thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that. Okay. So Rabbi Gamliel is the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he is the last person mentioned in Avot chronologically. Okay, everyone who's mentioned in Avot is either earlier or a few contemporaries of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's son. Okay, and so he really wait for a moment.
Good morning. I'll be home soon.
Oh, okay, so I'll wait for you.
Thank you.
So he gets to give the last word on this issue. And notice what he says. Excellence is the study of Torah when combined with a worldly occupation. So there were some who were saying that, like Rabbi Meir was saying, spend all your time studying Torah. He says no. You have to have both. In both, for toil in both of them keeps sin out of one's mind. But study of Torah, which is not combined with a worldly occupation, in the end comes to be neglected and becomes the cause of sin. Very striking. If you spend all your time doing only Torah, you end up in the wrong place. So that's sort of like what we saw before with in number 4. So there are actually three important themes, not themes, 3 important components of a person's life. One is studying Torah, one is earning a living, and the third is doing good deeds. And there has to be a balance between all 3 of them. And that's the conclusion that Rabban Gamliel, the third here, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, comes to. And if you read through Pirkei Avot, there are many Mishnayot which touch on this issue, but he sort of has the last word. And he says that, yes, everything is important. You have to make a balance between these different things. Otherwise, it can lead to who knows what. What kind of sin can it lead to here? Well, I guess he has in mind that if you don't have any way of earning a living, that you're going to live off of others or even steal from others, and that's not acceptable. Maimonides, for example, argues very vehemently that someone should not be paid for learning or teaching Torah. He says that every person has to have an occupation which provides them for their needs, but they should not be earning living from Torah, because Torah is not an occupation. His view was rejected by all of the other rabbis, because he said not only should people not be paid for teaching Torah, but also people should not be paid to study Torah, that the community should not support yeshivot, that if it does that, then it makes Torah a business. And we can probably think of ways in our times where Torah is regarded as a business, which it shouldn't be.
Could you repeat who it was that said that?
Yes, that was Maimonides. Maimonides argues very strenuously against that. In his commentary on Pirkei Avot, there are two things which particularly get his attention and his comments. One is on the issue of whether one can earn money from learning Torah, because there is a Mishnah which says that Rabbi Akiva says that you should not use the Torah as an axe to, in other words, it shouldn't be your profession. So that's one where Maimonides is very big on. And the other one that's very big, he's very strong on, is the notion of what kind of speech is appropriate and which kind of speech is not appropriate. He argues there also several pages of commentary on that. Those were two big issues in Avot. Okay, so I guess any other comments or questions? I don't know if we have time for any, or are we over?
We're at the point.
Oh, we're at the point. Good. So that brings us to the end of the second set of our 3 sessions. At the final session 3 weeks from now, we're going to focus on the ethical teachings of Avot, which is certainly appropriate since we refer to it in English as the ethics of the fathers. So we're going to be focusing on the ethics, which was not our focus either the last time or this time. I should mention again that my website is joerosenstein.com, and you can see there all the other things that I've written in addition to being able to purchase this book. About those of you who are here can get it here. And I have various other writings that I have posted there, which I'm not selling. So please visit joerosenstein.com. And so have a good day and happy Tu B'Shvat.